Okay, well, welcome everybody. Glad to have you here today. So we'll jump just right into this here. And so we're going back through more of chapter 6, and we're talking about monuments. Um, and so before we do, are there any other questions or comments about what we covered last week when we talked about monuments and corners? Okay, great. So just as kind of a refresher and a reminder to all of us as we talk about this, and we started our discussion off last week about this, is the difference between a monument and a corner, and kind of the need for us to be correct in our language and calls, particularly in this discussion, but I think to level up the profession as well. So when we talk about monuments, we're talking about any physical, natural, man-made, actually on the ground object that you can call to, right? So a brass cap being a monument, which is a representation of a corner, a section corner, perhaps, right? Or call to a fence, or call to an adjoiner, even being a man-made, construct, that's a created line. And then when we talk about corners, those are the theoretical locations. So if it's a property corner, that's the theoretical mathematical location of the corners and angle points of a deed, right? Or if we're in the sectionalized land, we talk about the northeast corner of a section. The corner is the the theoretical, the mathematical location of the corner of that section. And then the monument is the physical point on the ground that is the representation of that theoretical location. We talked quite a bit about how sometimes that corner may not necessarily be the the perfect location for any given corner. And we talked quite a bit about respecting original corners. We talked quite a bit about weighing the evidence of when do you reject a corner if it's found and it seems off. And we'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. And so we'll jump into it. Um, Let me see if I can share this well enough and still not kill bandwidth here. And I'll pull up our book for everyone to share. So I'm going to be on starting page 175. If you do have the book, and we're going to start talking about uncalled for monuments. And so when you guys hear uncalled for monuments, what do you guys think about? What comes to mind there?
Like a no reference monument.
So what do you mean by no reference monument?
A monument that wasn't ever, you can't find any record of it on a map anywhere. There's no history of it. There's no
Yep.
record of it. There's nothing. It's just a monument you found, and you're either going to accept it or reject it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Um, Anyone else have anything that comes to mind when you think about uncalled for monuments?
Unknown caller.
Not an
Yeah,
unknown call.
yeah. I usually, if I find a no record monument, it usually triggers more research for me, and I try to figure out where it came from. Look at old private survey records, that kind of stuff.
For
Yeah.
me,
So
the reference can be direct and be specifically named in the conveyance, or it can be indirect, where the conveyance mentions a survey or some other means or document that it in itself makes a reference to the monument. All of these things would call that in and show the intent of the grantor to go to that monument. And those monuments have the authority of a original monument, and their location, if it is the same, they are conclusive against the boundary. But there you need to understand whether those those original monuments are in their original location or not. And that's a matter of proof. Now, even though a monument is not an original corner, that doesn't mean that it may represent some other legal concept, such as estoppel or adverse possession or boundary line agreement. It may still be the corner, but it's not an original monument unless unless you can show somehow that it was referenced directly or indirectly by the conveyance.
That's a really good point. And I'd like to add, I think it's important when you're considering whether to accept or reject, as Robbie said, is to try to determine if anyone's relied on this monument. Has anybody built anything to it? Are there other ones of the same character on the other lot corners, or is this one just like a lone wolf sitting out there in the middle of, is it in the middle of the neighborhood by itself and you don't know where it came from? There's a lot of different factors that are going to come into play with that accept or reject determination. And just whether or not it's in the right place may not be as simple. How'd you find it? Did the property owner tell you it was there, or did you just happen to dig there and it was sitting there smiling at you?
Gathering process and weighing, right? That's a great point, David, and everybody. Thank you. The book calls for in here. It talks about a couple different uh, types of uncalled for monuments or monuments in the past, and um, so Jeff puts in here just this middle paragraph.
Can't hear you, Trent.
Hear me?
Now we can.
Okay, I don't know what happened there. So Jeff in this book calls for a couple different types of monuments. It's really interesting to me as I read this. He says in this middle paragraph, common knowledge in the surveying community, however, reveals that a 3-inch steel pipe with a steel cap screwed on the top was set by the steel and coal companies. That must be a regional thing for him because that's not common knowledge for me. So I was just curious if anyone else had experienced that, or what is common practice in your areas. You see it, it's an old, pretty typical thing for a surveyor to set, but it may be uncalled for, but it helps give confidence to what you find. Anyone have some experiences there of what you've found in the past? David, you're muted.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It could be anything. Somebody might have set 4x4 posts painted white on every lot corner, and those are the original monuments, and everybody knows this. Or, maybe some surveyor came in and set pipes for the whole neighborhood, and everybody knows this, but there's no record of it.
So,
Yeah, there's an area I've done work in that it's a bunch of cabin property, and it's pretty standard out here, but they were 1-inch rebar set everywhere. 1 inch is kind of bigger standard practice, but out in that cabin property, if you find one of those and it looks old, it is probably an original one. Even if it doesn't fit, none of them fit the plats. But they were set out there, and it's just kind of common knowledge if you know that area those were original corners. James, you were going to say something?
yeah, it's either original or it's not. If it's not referenced, if you don't have a reference to it, it's not an original monument. Period. Don't accept it on those grounds. But if it is a monument that the surrounding lot owners or landowners have utilized and honored and made their own deeds according to that mysterious monument with no pedigree, no history behind it. It is it will still be held to be useful against the local landowners who have used it. But if you get outside of that location where landowners have not made use of that monument, then it holds no weight. So you can have actually a situation where the local landowners surrounding, let's say, a 16th corner, have committed themselves and their boundaries to their lands to a monument that is in the wrong place for a GLO breakdown. But still, that will be the corner that their land must be measured from. But now, if you go outside of that, a quarter mile away, and you run into landowners who have no use for that corner, then you better consider the standard breakdown for their land. So it's a matter of whether the landowner has committed himself or honored that erroneous monument, and that's the case of he will be held exclusively against him. I don't know whether I explained that well or not.
Well, he wrote in the chat, I do a lot of surveying in the Denver area, and offsets for lot corners were originally Maltese crosses set in the curb. These have tremendous weight for us, even if not called for in the city records. Here in Utah, we generally see a copper rivet or a nail placed in the extension of lot lines in the curb, pretty standard. Sometimes they were set in the sidewalk. A lot of the 60s and 70s were set 3 feet offset to the property line or property corner in the sidewalk. So you kind of know that by the era of the plat what to look for. Martina said, in Park City, sometimes old mining corners are coincident with then or future lot corner locations. They're about 2 feet tall, thick steel pipes with old brass caps stamped with the mining claim info on there. And Robert threw a couple pictures in here.
Yeah, I threw a couple in there, Trent. I came across it recently when I was filing these record surveys, and I noticed it had, this is like the biggest pincushion I've ever seen as far as the spread goes. It had 2 section corners, common monuments, 212 feet apart, and it had records to both over time. So that was a pretty unique, per se, pincushion in my book.
Yeah, I've shared here in the past, but there's a couple in the areas in the county where I predominantly survey that there's 3 section corners at about a 500-foot radius, and they each have dates on them. So depending on the date the deed was written or a survey was tied, and some of those have been lost and not been replaced over time. So you kind of have to do a retracement between ties to each corner. To be able to connect the dots depending on the era of the deed or the survey you're retracing. So James was talking just a second ago about kind of original corners or corners that are old but may not be original. So I really found this interesting. He quotes Waddles here. It says, in the eyes of the law, chronology plays an important role. If monuments can be proven to have been set immediately prior to or coincident with the creation of the description, they are held to be emblematic of and the physical control of the written words, and more especially if cited. In contrast, if the timetable shows a material spread between the creation of the deed in words and the subsequent setting of the points on the ground, the monuments cannot be claimed as superior to calls. So what's that saying is, and we'll do this all the time on newer subdivisions. I'll hold off for for setting many of the corners till the construction's done. So I'm not resetting those 2 or 3 times, right, for expediency there. Um, and it happens from time to time that the construction's done, and then all of a sudden we've realized, oh hey, we need to get out there and set those corners. So there is some balance between, when the deed was written or when the plat was made and when those corners were set, because if time goes too far, there might be some other reliance considerations that we would need to think about, in conjunction with
Yo,
the
nigga,
corner itself or the deed.
yeah, call fire. Ooh,
I can't mute anybody because I don't have control here, but Vaughn, can you mute yourself there?
yes.
Thanks.
About what you were saying there about the timetable, uh, can anybody hear me? I'm not getting feedback. I'm having trouble with
I
my,
I can hear you.
okay. Uh, the timetable there has to do with, how original monument gets its special authority. And it has a special authority or weight because it could be seen by the grantee when he actually purchased or the land was transferred to him. So it has to be in place before the conveyance is delivered to the grantee. Now, in the case of the subdivision, you can hold off on actually setting those pins until you get ready to sell the first lot. And before you deliver that deed or that conveyance to the grantee, that pin needs to be set. Am I making sense here?
Yeah. Yep. Any questions or comments before we move on to this next little section here? So
No,
continue with this. Oh, go ahead, Dave.
I was going to say to add to James is I've heard that in the past too. Like a lot isn't considered legal to sell until the monuments are set and the monument bond and everything's released for getting those things set. And I guess they can't even sell the property, right, James, until that's done, at least here in California.
In Utah, I don't know of any code that specifically speaks to that order. Certainly, there needs to be a representation of what is being sold, so that the buyer can see on the ground. But as far as code goes, I'm not sure of anything in Utah particular. Other states might.
In Arkansas, the sale can take place, but the monuments that are set, if they're not set before the conveyance is delivered, they are not controlling monuments. And they're just what any retracement surveyor would set on the basis of the plat. We had a very large gated community of which I took over the surveying for in the 90s, but it was started in the 70s. And when it first began, the developer only set the front corners of the lot, and the rear corners were not monumented. The plats were very good, the control was very good, but those back monuments weren't set. And so anytime you find a monument at the back of one of these lots, it's not controlled, it's not original. And you're at liberty to set a point there that matches the lot geometry. That's the way it is in Arkansas.
And Corey threw in the chat here that in Colorado they cannot set corners in a subdivision until a lot is sold. They only set the exterior of the subdivision. So that's really interesting. So Corey, you might be on the hook for per lot for a number of years until everything gets sold out, maybe a larger or slow moving subdivision. And that's
When the lots are sold, it's typically not the subdividing surveyor that will set the corners for the lot. So, for example, I could be contracted to do the entire boundary, and then lots that are sold, it could be a different surveyors that sets those.
so. And I'm not familiar with Colorado. Do you have a recording act or a filing act for surveys? Are they filing a secondary survey of a retracement boundary for that?
But not typically for that, but we do have recording statutes. For any time a monument goes in the ground, a plat has to be recorded.
And that's, I mean, most states have it. We've talked about it here, but I have a lot of questions for you, Corey, because I want to get to maybe what we would talk about as the original surveyor clause when we talk about a subdivision plat, that the original surveyor wouldn't then be setting all the monuments, because he would be the one that has control over that. And so Jeff talks about this. He hasn't talked so much in this book, but in his podcast he talks about the second surveyor phenomenon that we have in Utah. And that might play into a little bit what you're doing there, in a different context. But I'm just curious, is there any discussion in Colorado about the original surveyor in a subdivision like that, and him not setting corners?
It depends on the jurisdiction, I think, if I understand your question correctly. There are a couple of counties where you have to make sure the corners for the entire subdivision is in before you do your lot, in which case you will have to reset if any are missing. But those are just few jurisdictions. Most of the time, you're only concerned with your lot, so you're not retracing the entire boundary. But it depends on what you need from the boundary. Does that make sense?
Hey, that makes, yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, I'm going to have to chew on that one for a little bit. That brings up a lot of questions that may not be pertinent to now, but some of the discussions we've had. But yeah, we'll have to keep joining in. Let's talk about those more, because I do have some curiosities there. But for the sake of moving on, let's continue on with the monument discussion versus the sidetrack we're getting to with original surveyors. So Jeff's here at the top of this page. He talks about kind of the nuances of Brown and Waddles from the last page, and he quotes this. Well, he says here, in reality, it's not as cut and dried as Brown makes it out to be, and the proof Waddles requires is not as demanding. Uncalled for monuments must be considered against all of the boundary evidence gathered by the land surveyor during the course of conducting a survey of property. The decision whether to hold an uncalled for monument or set a new monument needs to be one of the last decisions made in resolving a boundary problem. We've talked about this quite a bit, that evidence gathering procedure. And so as you've gathered all of the evidence and weighed it, you can't make a decision until you have everything in there. As you gather more, it might bring more questions up, and you keep chasing that as the case may be. This New Hampshire case here, it says the plaintiffs argue that because there were no monuments called for in the deeds to establish the corners, the course of south 70 degrees east must control over all other factors in the establishment of the line. While generally in the absence of monuments, the course will control distance if they are inconsistent. Continues on, this is not the rule when the call for a course appears in error and conflicts with all the other calls in the deeds and other evidence on the ground. So the trial court here was entitled to accept the testimony of the surveyor that the course was incorrect and determine from all the evidence in the case that the correct location of the boundary line. So here's kind of an example of where if the overwhelming amount of evidence shows that a monument might be wrong, you could determine it's wrong, or you could hold a monument despite everything, and determine that the map is wrong, which is what happened in this case. Okay, jumping on here. So the next little section here is calls or center of a monument, and this is always the one thing that I love discussing when we talk about monuments. I did a big survey a few years ago. It was very rural, and one of the corners was this old 6x6 brick pillar that was the remnant of an old gate and wall. None of the gate, none of the fence, nothing else stands today, but this 6x6 brick pillar. It was the northwest corner of the property. Not an urban subdivision, very rural farmland area, and the original plat just called for the 6x6 brick structure. That was it. And so we went the rounds kind of in the office discussing how best do you survey it, because the center didn't really fit, and not one corner really fit by distance or calls. And it says here in the book, and this is generally going to be the case, a call for the monument is a call for the center of the monument. He says it may seem self-evident who would call for a 6x6 inch concrete monument for the corner and expect the boundary line to run up the edge of one and then dance around the 90-degree calls. But to throw it again out to the group here, what have you experienced with interesting calls like this, where they're larger calls to a monument, the center of something? Or we talked a couple weeks ago about some experiences in North Dakota where you actually had the old stone with the GLO brass cap next to it. But throw it out to the group here. What are your experiences with centers of monuments?
I'd like to address that. And really, the idea of center of the monument is incorrect. Let's take the case of taking out a loan, and you agree to pay off the loan on a certain date. And someplace in that loan will be the words, and time is of the essence. If you're one day early or one day late, that's a problem. But what it doesn't do is you don't say that the payment that you make has to be done at midday on the named day. It just says on that date. And so you can make your loan payment at 10 o'clock in the morning, or you can make it at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Both of those satisfy the contract. And the person who's making the payment makes the decision about when that time will be. Now, when it comes to monuments that are large and a particular point on the monument is not included in the deed, then there is no law, at least in Arkansas, and I doubt any other state, that commands a particular precision to conveyances. They leave it up to the landowners to decide what will be a significant precision for a conveyance. So whenever a larger monument, such as it was described here, or a tree, or a large boulder, or whatever is mentioned in a deed, then its precise location is a little bit ambiguous. And the grantee has a right to occupy land to any corner that falls on that monument. You have to look at the actual occupation of the person, if it of either the grantee, or if he does it, the grantor, and how they assume a occupation line to that monument. And if it goes to that, if the occupation goes to someplace on the monument, that is the correct location of the precise location of the corner, and it's determined by the actions of the landowners.
Common practice has been, at least in my experience, that we do go to the
Hey, you cut out again, Trent. No, it's kind of muted. There you go. That's better.
A little bit better.
Okay,
Hey,
cutting in and out here.
there you are.
I was just going on a good rant too, guys. Um, I was telling James that I was about to argue with him and disagree with what he was saying, because in my experience on say like a right of way monument, it's a 4x4 concrete post, which I found quite a bit in the Midwest. The easiest and most consistent place to measure to is the center of that. And then I listened to what James was saying, and I can understand exactly what it is it is up to those landowners to determine how it is. And then I started thinking about what I commonly see out here in other places is old railroad tie fences, right? And where would I shoot the railroad tie fence if I'm actually out in the field shooting it? Well, I was out there yesterday on a job site with a client. We're looking at a boundary issue, and the barbed wire fence runs along the outside corners of all these railroad tie fences. And as we start measuring it, that outside corner, for me, is the best evidence of occupation and reliance throughout there, and it tends to match all the distances. On a railroad tie fence, the inside of that, the 1 foot width of the railroad tie fence is maintained by that inside landowner. The fence itself is on the outside of it, and actually does become a really good evidence of that. And so in that case, I wouldn't hold to the center of the railroad tie fence as the best evidence. I'd actually locate the outside. Thoughts, comments, or arguments against that, or a different approach?
What if you had both landowners telling you that they built that railroad tie fence 1 foot on one property all the way around? Then you're going to hold a line 1 foot off of the railroad tie fence, right? You kind of got to ask around.
Exactly. That's that additional evidence we got to keep chasing, right? That's some extrinsic evidence, some witness testimony that would then trump my initial reaction. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to jump way ahead here. I don't go too far ahead. Monument pedigree 6.06 here. So I want to throw it out to the group again, get you guys discussing just in case I keep cutting out here. But what do you guys do in your states to ensure monument pedigree? And I think in this case, we're probably talking about government monuments, if you will, section corners, GLO monuments, something that might have perhaps a corner record to or regular survey ties to. What are the requirements in your states? So in Utah, we've talked about this, but we are unique that we have a county surveyor. So in our class 1 and 2 counties, they all have an elected county surveyor that is responsible for the section corners, the PLSS pedigree. So they are publishing regularly monument corner records, and so that's what we use if we have to go revisit a corner to tie to it. Recently, I've been doing some surveying in Idaho with one of my survey partners there, and I'm getting to know some of their requirements. And one of the things that I've learned there is every time you go visit a corner, you need to tie out the witnesses or the straddles to the corner or reference points or ties or whatever they might be, and you need to file a new corner record in the record to say that you visited that recently. Wisconsin had a very similar requirement there. How about some of our California guys? What's the general practice out there? Anybody willing to jump in and answer that?
I don't know about the GLO corners, but pedigree for any monument here would be just have it shown on a map. Where did it come from? What map set it? Can you tell? And then, wait, did any other maps perpetuate it?
So you're talking more about the property corner side of things?
Right. Because down here in Southern California, we don't have we have very few actual public lands corners down here, especially in Orange County. We have more rancho corners than anything else. Um, so yeah, it's all about, you're looking at the property corners, then you're looking at what map set it, where did it come from?
Hey, James,
Well,
what about in your neck of the woods?
uh, in Arkansas, uh, there's very little responsibility from a statute standpoint about GLO corners. If they're provable, they're where they were originally set. Now, the county surveyor is sometimes tasked with relocating those corners, but in that case, he has no authority to really command the monument he set as being the monument that controls everybody. It's considered that a county surveyor who works within the statute, the requirements of the statute, which very few of them do, produces a survey that is considered, whether it's no matter where it's at, it's considered prima facie correct until proven wrong. But as soon as you can prove that the county surveyor probably made a mistake, it's thrown out like every other surveyor. It comes down to the evidence that's available.
Okay, thanks, James. So Joseph just threw out here kind of the other side of that. I really think this is very interesting. It says New Jersey appropriate corner markers such as stakes, iron pins, cut crosses, monuments, and such other markers as may be authorized under D2 below shall be set either by the licensed professional land surveyor or under their supervision. Such markers shall be set at each
The long message.
such property corner not previously marked by a property marker unless the actual corner is not accessible, unless a written waiver signed by the ultimate user and witnessed by a person other than a professional land surveyor is obtained as set forth. The failure to obtain a waiver when corner markers are not set shall be considered professional misconduct. That's pretty heavy there. That's very interesting. And Corey threw in the chat, he can talk about Colorado. Corey, tell us a little bit about how you do it in Colorado there.
Oh, Colorado is big on public land monuments. It's sort of a double whammy that we perpetuate it as much as we do. So for decades now, we've had to file monument records on the section corners and aliquot corners, all of those going back to the 80s. And for the most part, most surveyors are good about filing those in time. Coupled with that, many jurisdictions require that their plats are actually tied to section corners. And anytime a section corner is used as control, a new monument record has to be filed. So typically when you come across a monument, we have to stamp our LS on there, and there's typically a plat that goes along with that. So we have the monument record itself, but also when it was used in a plat. And both of those together can help perpetuate that location.
Hey, great. Thank you for sharing that.
I should have mentioned that our state surveyor has a program that's for the recovery of section counters and quarter counters. And surveyors are encouraged to, where they find evidence of the original location of one of those counters, to perpetuate that by completing a restoring of that counter, and where all of the evidence that proves its location is put into the record, and that is both filed at the county and the state level. So you may have some good evidence there that later on would have been lost, but a perpetuated counter, although it is not proof absolute, it can be strong evidence for a counter that you need to use.
The next little bit here is the locally accepted monument. Can you hear me still?
Yep.
Okay, good. So the locally accepted monument is one that may actually be in a poor location, but everyone's relied upon it, and the locals know that the old farmers who are the best evidence for some of this stuff, it's their testimony that can help shed light to this is what we've always used as this property corner here. So in the middle paragraph it says the testimony of local landowners relative to the use and history of a locally accepted monuments can be very useful evidence and should not be ignored. Should the local landowners be summoned into court in a boundary dispute case, their testimony about the history and use of the corner and the boundary lines associated with it will be admissible and could be the deciding factor in the case. So it gets into the federal rules of evidence we've talked about, and about testimony being a great tool that we have as surveyors to establish the location of corners or the history of an area or of occupation. So that is definitely one thing to think about when we're gathering evidence, so that we don't create pincushions. What has everyone else done in the area? This is why I'm a huge proponent, and it's getting harder to do sometimes, but I've always believed that, there should be an area of practice that we localize in. I cover the northern area of Utah. Martina was on here. She's up in the Park City area, and I know she's been surveying in Utah for a long time. But I don't go up to Park City. It's about a 45-minute drive from where I am, but there's a whole other local kind of way of doing things, local search practices and all that stuff, and I'm just not familiar with it. And I could certainly get familiar with it, but I avoid working in that area because of this testimony side of things, or familiarity locally of that.
Hey Troy, would that be something similar to like a boundary line agreement you would perform for what you just mentioned?
Like the locally accepted monument?
Yeah, if all the landowners are using it, you gotta kind of make a record of that. Would that be something for like the use of a boundary line agreement between the neighbors, and then it's kind of then it's actually kind of recorded and official?
That's a great question. I think in Utah, no, because we have very specific boundary line agreement rules and kind of language that's codified. So boundary line agreement, the way we approach it is a boundary line that's unknown, and may be in dispute, and both landowners have occupied to that line or haven't and need to correct it, right? And so you would file a description of that line, have a record of survey follow with it. Certainly, I think your approach is probably about right, meaning you're going to put something in the record, whether it is a corner monument record, if that's something in your state, or in your narrative on the face of your survey. I spoke with X landowner, and we discussed the boundary line location or the monument location. This has been accepted by their testimony. This is why I'm holding this line or respecting that. Why that may not be necessarily a boundary line agreement, I think that might be the approach that you're thinking of there, and that's probably a little bit more state specific about exactly how that's called out.
Gotcha.
Great question, though.
I would say that one of the things you need to consider in these circumstances is whether your state has an ancient document rule and what the length of period is for that. Anytime that you have a controversy that winds up in litigation, one of the things that's going to be weigh upon their evidence is whether that was something that took place or your evidence predates any of the controversy about where the boundary line's at. And this is especially true of ancient documents, will in Arkansas will be considered to be correct until they're proven wrong. So that gives an extra weight to evidence that predates a controversy. And where landowners have used a corner and their occupation goes up to that corner, and they have used that corner to sell off other lands, and the description came from that corner, that if that has been done for a number of years, it's almost certain that a court will not go in there and try to correct something that was a mistake that was made 40 or 50 years ago. They just don't do it.
Wonderful. Great discussion, guys. Any other kind of questions about locally accepted monuments? There's a couple of things I'm trying to rush through some of these a little bit because there's two discussions I really do want to get into. So I'm going to jump to the next one then. So 193 at 608, public land survey corners. And this could be a whole class. I think we've touched on this a lot because the majority of us tend to work in PLSS states. But I do want to hit on a couple things and a couple vocabulary. So in the public land survey system, the term corner and monument might as well be considered synonymous. As a result of the Act of 1805, the monuments set by the government surveyors are the corners of the various townships, sections, and quarter sections. All of the corners marked in the surveys returned by the Surveyor General shall be established as the proper corners of sections or subdivisions of sections which they were intended to designate. And this is really the crux of kind of the discussion we have when we talk about the monument is the corner no matter what. That really stems from a lot of the PLSS system and this act here, where it does codify that, hey, they may have said it wrong, but now it is. That is the corner because that's what was set by the government. And then we talk about a few different identities of this corner. Lost, obliterated, and existent. Anyone want to just touch on that for a second? Explain the differences between the three. So an existent corner is one whose original position can be identified by substantial evidence of the monument or its accessories. So the actual physical monument for a corner is not there, but it can be recovered in some fashion because there's enough evidence to really do that. Okay. An obliterated corner is an existent corner where at the corner's original position there are no remaining traces of the monument or its accessories, but whose position has been perpetuated or the point for which may be recovered by substantial evidence from the acts or reliable testimony of interested landowners. And a lost corner is one whose original position cannot be determined by substantial evidence either from traces of the original marks or from acceptable evidence of reliable testimony that bears upon the original position and whose location can be restored only by reference to one or more interdependent corners. So that lost one is a pretty heavy mark to hit to call a corner lost. At worst case, you can always go back to old GLO notes and measurements and at least start trying to tie that down. Okay, we've got the pincushion corner. That's the whole thing we've been talking about, right? A corner who has multiple monuments, multiple locations to it set on the ground, causing confusion. I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time on this, probably to Jeff's dismay, but I really do want to get to a major discussion here because I'm curious to see what you guys think here. But here's a great example of a really bad pincushion. I mean, there's 3 big brass caps right there in that picture. Okay, and I'm going to roll down here to this. I think this is the next section here. Monument removal. So I go back and forth and I spend way too much time on social media and then I'll take big breaks. And those that do follow me or connect with me on there know that I spent quite a bit the last couple of years trying to post some interesting notes about surveying, about equipment, about the different types of survey discussions we've had here. And Wisdom Wednesday got tagged on LinkedIn. I think it was LinkedIn, it was LinkedIn just last week from a not to call him out, but a Canadian surveyor that's been posting quite a bit on there and has some really interesting articles and things to note on there. But he was talking about monument removal. And so I thought we'd get into an all-out brawl here. I wanted to know what you guys thought and what, if anything, your states had in code regarding monument removal.
Man, Trent, did you see my comment to that post? I reposted that one.
Yeah, I tried to track it, and then this afternoon I was trying to go back through and refresh it so I could bring up a little bit more. I need to go follow a little bit more. It got pretty big and long there, so my ADHD kicked in.
It did, Trent. I actually threw in the Wisdom Wednesday schedule and said, let's hear about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've done this a few times, pulled monuments out, and it's usually my reasoning is that I want to, well, first of all, it's got to be mapped. It's got to be on a filed map for me personally. I'm going to leave a record if I'm going to do something like that. And I've asked a lot of other surveyors about this, and I really get mixed responses. Some people say, yeah, go ahead. And some people, it seems like most say, no, it's not acceptable because someone may have relied on it. My feeling is that if it's something that's going to cause my client confusion in the course of their construction, then I might consider removing it. A few times that I have actually removed the monuments, I have later felt like maybe I shouldn't have done it and been second guessing myself. And I think that my best practice personally is if I'm going to set another monument next to a monument and reject the one that I found, I'm going to probably just bury it, like just drive it down into the ground to where nobody's going to find it unless they're really, really looking for it. And then have mine, sticking up or more readily available so that it's there if somebody really wants it, but it's not going to be found accidentally and used by mistake. And I'm in Northern California.
I have that same argument too. I think it should be removed. I mean, it's in the PLS Act. I think it's 8771 of record of survey requirements that it actually says the word remove. So if you remove them, it has the word remove. So it sounds like you can remove a monument, but you're going to have to file a record of survey and do that. So I had an argument, Trent, with the same on there. There's a few guys chiming in on the LinkedIn, but yeah, as long as you go through the proper requirements and you did all your homework and you exhausted everything and you could, like, why leave something that's messed up that could actually cause a problem in the future? Why leave something for someone else? I mean, I feel like as a surveyor, your job is to fix things when it needs to be fixed and not run away from them. Just like there's a new law came into California on the first that if you find a monument that's in poor condition, or you can't just throw on the map that you found a monument that's bad or bent or loose. You gotta fix it and make it right. And I feel like if you don't fix a pincushion like that, you're just turning your back on something that someone else could rely on. That is wrong.
Amen. Yeah,
Okay.
there's no statute in California that I'm aware of that prohibits removal of survey monuments by surveyors. I think
Yeah.
you might get in trouble if you're not a surveyor and you go around pulling people's monuments out.
Yeah, my
I
argument was original monuments. If you're pulling original monuments thinking it's out of position, then you should go straight to the damn board, right? Because you should. I mean, like, this is only my viewpoint is something that's in a very small area. And I mean, don't go just ripping out original monuments left and right because of measurements being off. And there was people trying to argue that fact, and it wasn't really pincushion effect really per se. It was just people freak out when you hear the word removing a monument, right?
I'm gonna take the opposite thing, the opposite argument on this. Don't do it. Don't pull monuments. You think you've got everything exactly tied down. You've proved the original location of an original monument. That may be true. But what you might not know is that 15 years ago, that corner was involved in a litigation, and the court recognized the corner that you pulled up. Let me tell you, you were wrong. Don't pull corners because you can't be certain that you're right in any survey. I don't care how much research you do. You can't be certain. And so you shouldn't pull that up, with one exception. And that is if you're in litigation, you need to get those extra corners removed if the corner is in litigation between the landowners. And to do that, you need to go to your attorney that's representing your client and ask him to modify the pleadings to request the court to direct the removal of erroneous pins, so that whenever the court decides that one monument is to be the corner from here on out, that they will be in a position to give authorization to a land surveyor to go out there and pull those erroneous corners up and remove them. And if you don't ask for it in the pleadings, the court's not going to give you that authority. So that's really important there that you work with the attorney if you want to get rid of those erroneous corners. And that's the one exception I want to make on pulling corners. I'm finished.
James, I honestly see both sides of this, particularly in the retracement side of this. But for me, there is a little bit of a slippery slope because
You're quiet again, Trent.
no. How about now?
No.
Come on back,
No.
Trent. There you go.
Right here, there we go.
All right.
So I see both sides of this, and I struggle with the answer to this because I'm not aware of any code directly in Utah that speaks to this, and I'm not aware of any discussions that happen in our professional society where I see this happening at all or very often. I am curious to think though that you know, if I were to find one, that I would want to pull. Certainly, I like noting that on the record, the survey, pointing it out to the landowners, right, and saying, this is why I disagree with this one. But this is the balance of that pincushion effect, right? If I disagree with the corner there, it's got to be a lot of evidence for me to set another corner and potentially create a pincushion. That's a whole part of this discussion. We're trying to avoid doing that. I have, when known, called another surveyor to have a discussion of, I found this corner here, and I know it's yours, and I disagree with it. Can we look at it together? I would say about 80% of the time, I have a really good discussion with that surveyor. But about 20% of the time, I've been told to go pound sand, and I'm not wrong, and they are unwilling to work. So here's my challenge to each of you guys is to either one, go read through your state code, verify it. There are some quotes here of Alabama state code where Jeff talks about desecration of a monument, but it doesn't speak very clearly to a survey monument, right? And then get involved in your state society and go reach out to your state board. I would be curious to see in your standards and ethics committee, if this question was to be raised, what type of discussion would come out of the state board discussion, if any, and what they might say. And get a group, because where I'll land on this is the common and standard practice in your state and the laws that govern that. So that's what I have. I wanted to get through there. Is there any other thoughts or questions? Let's say I see a couple chats in here. So Colorado, by state statute, we have to show conflicts and explain on the face of the plat why we don't accept it. And Joseph said, I would imagine you can get in big trouble with a neighboring property if you pull a corner that doesn't agree with your opinion, if they paid for that corner and set it out and they find out you pulled it out. So couple of things to consider there, but I can see why pulling a corner, if given permission from the setting surveyor, the retracing surveyor, original surveyor, and getting some sort of permission whose corner that belongs to, and working with both adjacent landowners to do it, I can see why that would be a good thing to do from time to time, so that we don't cause confusion and pull out corners and leave a pincushion there. Anyone else want to jump in on this one? I was hoping for a little bit more discussion here.
Yeah, I had a surveyor. I found a record monument, no record monument, unrecorded, with an LS tag on it, and called the surveyor, and he told me he had no recollection of ever setting that monument, and asked me politely to remove it. So, and there was more than one on that lot. So I was, and I reset my own monuments in very similar locations. So it was in the right spot. It wasn't, it didn't have the right number on it, I guess, because he didn't, maybe it was set fraudulently, or, I don't know if the guy was losing his memory or what, but he told me to take it out, so I had no problem doing that one. And another thing is, I think if you file a map that's publicly available, and it shows where the monument was, and you're referencing it for the record, then if there was some sort of legal ramification attached to that monument, someone else could go and put it back and recreate that location very easily.
Well,
Yeah,
that's what I saw down in Orange County in the 6 years I've been checking corner records and record of surveys down here. We had, I've only seen one map that pulled a monument, and it was down Newport Beach. And yeah, the surveyor, it was very similar as what you had, David. Didn't want to cause a confusion for his client. It would have created a pincushion, but he also had bearing and distance to the other monument that he was taking out. And he had a note on there that says, I'm pulling this monument and setting my own near it. So that's the only time that I've seen it in the 6 years that I've been looking at maps. So it doesn't happen very often, but it does happen, and we can do it. I think it's our professional duty to take care of that when that comes up like that. We don't need more confusion.
yeah, David.
Absolutely.
Any good surveyor is going to go out and retrace a survey, should be pulling all the information, all the maps, all the documents. So there shouldn't be an excuse of, oh, like removing it. There's going to be evidence there. Like if you're referencing that original one, like you mentioned, before you pull it and have all your dimensions and everything, there should be no way you could recreate that from your map.
Well,
Oh, James.
I don't know. You better not be in Arkansas, because if you pull that pin, and it was a subject of litigation 10 years before that, and a judge awarded those landowners that as a corner, and you get pulled back in front of that judge, you're kind of in trouble, from a legal standpoint. The damages are or whatever you might get on that, that might be, you might be having pay punitive damages over something like that. And as
Is
far as the
Arkansas
state,
a recording state? Because that's an important distinction.
yes, it is a recording state,
Okay.
but that's not going to help you out. And the state board is not going to help you out. In the first place, the state board doesn't have any authority to grant surveyors a right to pull pins. It's not their decision to make. It's a legal distinction. And you need to understand that about what authority your state board has. It may be different in different states. I don't know. All I know is what Arkansas is. And it can be an eye opener when a surveyor calls you and says he doesn't agree with your pen out there, and you go out there and look at it, and sure enough, that surveyor is right, because your pen has been moved, and you can prove it. And your pen, if it was still where you originally set it, it would agree perfectly with the second surveyor that's just called you. So that's one of the ways that you find out that your pens sometimes get moved. And sometimes it can be a surveyor. It's happened to me only twice. And I doubt those surveyors are ever going to pull another one of my pens, not get caught at it. So I don't know.
I agree, James, but if the surveyor did his right amount of homework, he would have found that court document that referenced that monument for that court document. So I think that where it lies is that you got to lift up every rock and look under it before you even think about removing something. And going back to what Trent said too, calling the other surveyor and say, hey, I found this thing and here's what I see. Like, what should we do about it? Is a good approach. But I agree, James. Like if you didn't do your right amount of homework, no matter what state you're in, it sounds like Arkansas as well, and you just go yanking stuff out, you're going to find yourself in a lot of trouble quick.
Well, in Arkansas, there's no index about litigation on land, and that you can go and find where a court case was involved on a particular location of land. And I don't know, I tried to get into this to a situation where I asked my client on every surveyor, do you know whether this survey or this land has ever been in a dispute that wound up in litigation? And I don't know how many of you surveyors ask your clients that. Do you even talk to your clients? Are you hired by some agency to perform a surveyor?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I mean, so I learned to survey in Texas, and they don't record typical survey, boundary surveys. It's in a shoebox in the client's attic. And I don't think it, that's a little bit different of a situation. I don't know if I'd go around pulling pins out there that weren't tagged, and whether I liked them or not, I might just leave them because for that reason, because I don't know who said it or when or why. But there is we have identified a few situations where it's appropriate, and I think that the one that was just mentioned, if the corner monument is obviously disturbed or known to be disturbed and out of original position, relative to other monuments from the same survey, and this is with the caveat that original survey monuments for a subdivision are excluded. Then I agree with David Bush. It is your professional duty to, or that's the way I see it, to, not leave evidence that's going to create future confusion for your clients.
Jeff has talked about in the classes here the 51% rule, right? You just have to be enough, the standard of care if it were to go to court, right? Can you sway that just enough to convince? And so that's another thing to consider here. But I think this has been a great discussion about this. I know we're all going to have different opinions, and each state's going to be a little different. So thank you for having a polite and robust discussion. This has been great. When we got down to well, most weeks it's just me sitting here talking, so I'm happy to have you guys go do some back and forth here. And again, this is going to raise us up as experienced surveyors as better surveyors, and it's going to give questions to our younger surveyors to ask, because maybe they never even thought of that, right? Either argument, and so now they can go to their mentors and have that discussion of what is it we do here? What is the best practice? Or if their mentor asks them to pull it and they've kind of decided now that it's not in the best interest, and they can push back on their mentors, say, well, really, why are we doing this? I think this is all makes us better. So I'm glad we had two sides to the story and a good discussion there. Well, that brings us to the end of the chapter. Oh, James, you have more to add? Go for it.
Is this our last chapter on this book?
No, so this is the end of chapter 6. So we've got chapter 7. We're because of conferences in February, we're not really to the end of the month, but we'll start chapter 7. We're about a little over halfway through the book.
Okay, well, I've got stuff I'd like to say, but I want to wait till the end. It would be more appropriate.
Okay. Hey, well, with that, yeah, we ended a little earlier than I planned, but that's great. Anyone else have anything to add before we end it for the night?
No, but thank you. Great.
Yep.
Great topic. Great discussion.